Hello, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, Western allies are ramping up their rhetoric, getting ready for possible military action against Syria. But who will pay the price? Our digital producer Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback. This is a major news story we're covering on Al Jazeera, of course, but what is our community saying about it?
Well, Femi, as you and I well know, we get requests to cover Syria on a near daily basis. I pulled up on my screen just some of the requests we got in the last couple of days on Facebook to our "What stories are you following today?" question. You can see a smattering of people saying Syria. So for those of you at home, you asked, and today the show is for you. Tweet us your comments and your questions during today's conversation using hashtag AJStream.
Joining us in the studio, we have Kurt Volker. Kurt is a former ambassador to NATO. He's been making the case for military intervention in Syria for more than a year. Kurt, it's great to have you here in the stream.
Great to be here, thanks.
Very patient man, shouting out there in the dark. We'll hear more from you in just a little while. But we also want to hear more from you as we're doing the program. If you go to stream.aljazeera.com, I will show you how you do that. So here we are on the Syria in the Crosshairs page, which is for today's show. Keep scrolling down to the bottom. There you will find a poll. Let me show you what poll and what the poll question is. It is, would international military strikes against Syria make the situation there better, worse, or no different? So right now we've got 17% for better, 52% for worse, 31% for no difference. It is a Twitter poll, so you can actually register your vote really during the programs. As you're listening to the guests, you may have a different thought. So maybe wait 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then Malika will check back in to see how that vote and that poll is going. And we'll do that throughout the program.
I'm Yisr Batar, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Syrian Coalition DC mission, and I'm in the stream.
Western allies have ramped up their rhetoric in preparation for the possible use of military force against Syria. Syrian opposition leaders say that they were told strikes against President Bashar al-Assad's regime could happen within days. The United Kingdom has just submitted a proposal for a resolution to the UN Security Council condemning suspected chemical attacks. The UK wants member states to authorise, I'm going to quote here, all necessary measures, end of quote, to protect civilians. But after hours of discussion and fierce opposition from Russia and China on Wednesday, the meeting ended with no vote. Britain, France and the United States say that President Assad's forces carried out the chemical weapon attack in the suburbs of Damascus on August the 21st, killing hundreds. Damascus denies the attack and blames foreign terrorists. As UN inspectors are continuing their investigation on the ground, Washington is evaluating a limited military retaliation as a strong signal to the Syrian president. So, as the military option is being discussed, who's got more to lose, the Syrian government or its people? To help us talk about this, we're joined via Skype by Simon Adams. He's an executive director of the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect. In our Google Plus Hangout, we have Omar Hosino. He is a Syrian foreign and defense policy researcher and a contributor to the website Syria Deeply. He's in favor of limited intervention. And Kamil Altraqi is a Syrian commentator who is against any use of military force. Gentlemen, it is great to have all of you here in the stream. I'm going to start with Kamil. That chemical weapons attack in the suburbs of Damascus, who do you think did it?
I make it a point not to think of anything where we do not have enough proof. I mean, in the civilized part of the world, we have everybody's innocent until proven guilty. But in Middle East politics, for some reason, the international community always has the guilty party announced within hours from any event taking place. So no, I do not know who committed that act. Apparently, it is true that there are chemical material, if we don't call them weapons, were used, but I don't think anybody knows exactly. The only evidence I heard of is some Israeli intelligence intercepting two Syrian officers talking about it, apparently, one of them complaining to the other. That's a story we read in Foreign Policy.
Okay.
I don't have an opinion yet with it.
All right, see, Kurt, this is really important because France and the UK and the United States, just to name 3 allies working together, they all seem pretty convinced who's responsible for this chemical weapons attack.
Right. Well, let me just comment on that. First off, most of the time you will never have 100% certainty of anything.
Right.
That's just the nature of the world. And you have to make the best, most reasonable judgments that you can. Secondly, so there's 3 levels here. There's what's on the surface. What do you just see? Second is what might you have in intelligence that you collect yourselves. Thirdly, what do UN inspectors uncover and report? Just on the surface of it, you're looking at a large-scale chemical attack in an area that was controlled by the opposition being attacked by the government, using agents that were in the hands of the government. So the preponderance of evidence is that the government was involved here. But we don't know that with 100% certainty. Then you have what you get through intelligence channels, which has not been released publicly, and I'm not privy to it. What you hear from the US and UK and French and other governments, though, seems to me to indicate that they feel they have more information than just what's on the surface.
So Kurt, I mean, you've worked in diplomatic circles, you've got great sources that we can only kind of guess at. What do you think they're working on to say, okay, this is a chemical weapons attack, and it was President Assad who was responsible for it?
What they're looking for, my guess, is what they're looking for, and you never really know, but I'm sure that they have pretty precise information about what was used and where it was used and when it was used.
Even though the UN is still investigating?
Yeah, I'm sure that the UN has some of this too, but of course the UN wants to prepare a proper report. But I think through intelligence channels you have that. What they're going to be looking for is the connection between the command and control of the regime and that actual usage, because that's the thing that's really going to make it critical for people. But again, let's not lose sight of the big picture here. The idea that it was somebody else with the access to those kinds of weapons in that scale in those areas is very hard to believe compared to the probability that it would have been the regime. So you're never going to know 100%, but you certainly have a very strong indication, and they're just looking to see how much stronger that can be presented.
You mentioned a strong indication. Simon, we got a tweet here from someone who doesn't quite think so. Menzies says, I personally think there is a need for concrete evidence before any approval by the UN. So we know the UN team is there, but do they have a mandate to determine which side was responsible, even if they do find the evidence that Menzies is mentioning here on Twitter?
Well, first of all, on the last point, we don't know who did this, but I think, as the ambassador just said, I mean, this was a large-scale and fairly sophisticated attack. Somebody gassed those people on the 21st of August. I think that's fairly irrefutable now. Large number of casualties, 300 and something at least counted by Médecins Sans Frontières, more than 1,000 people affected. So we know that that is the reality we're dealing with. So the question is then, who did it? Now, what the UN inspectors can do is can show that that a chemical attack took place. They can determine the nature of that attack, and that will certainly point in a particular direction about who might have been responsible. And then I presume it will be up to the Secretary General or to his advisors to determine who they think was probably culpable. And then I think it's up to the world to decide how it wants to act in response to that, to do something or to do nothing.
Omar, as a Syrian outside of Syria, for the last 2.5 years you've been watching things deteriorate in your country. What do you make now of various countries saying, okay, this is the red line and it's important that we actually do something now? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think not just as a Syrian, but as a citizen of the world, if the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations is allowed to become normal in the international world, if this is going to become a norm that we're going to permit this is going to have far-reaching consequences all over the world. I mean, President Obama said that this was a red line, that this level of carnage would not be tolerated. And since then, it's almost been half of a year since the first alleged chemical weapons attack. We have 12 chemical weapons attacks that both British and American intelligence have said that have been done, and nothing has really come out of this. Now, this has been years since the Halabja attacks happened in 1986 under Saddam Hussein, and we've generally said in the international community that usage of chemical weapons against the civilian population will be something that will not be tolerated. If we begin to allow this now, if after we say that this is a red line, we do not enforce this red line, we do not just encourage the Syrian regime to use these weapons, but, for example, other countries in the world with chemical weapons, with dictatorships, will be encouraged to further further use them. The lesson that we are giving is you are incentivized to use these weapons because the red lines against these weapons will not be enforced. And this is a very troubling development in international politics in general.
But then is it then about saving face and less about saving the Syrian people? On Facebook, Aisha says, before the chemical weapons attack, the death toll was high. There was much violence. Right. Why didn't they speak up earlier? Why now, Ambassador?
Right. Well, I agree with that comment. I think that we should have acted much earlier. I was arguing a year and a half ago when there was only 9,000 people killed. That's the time to intervene before this gets any worse, because we knew what the intentions of Assad were. He declared them himself. And that would have been a time to intervene and stop it with much less bloodshed. That being said, I think there's 2 points here to military force. One of them is not a punishment for the regime having just done it, but a deterrent to doing it again. That's the first step, and I think that's what people are actively talking about here in Washington and London and Paris. The second thing is to strategically alter the course of the conflict. That, I think, also is essential, because to me, it's the what-if question. What if you do this and then what? You got to actually have a strategic plan. That we don't have, and no one seems to be willing to take on.
I really want to bring in one of our Syrian guests into this conversation again. Camille, as a Syrian and you're looking at the world discussing your country and what's happening, how do you feel about military intervention? Where do you stand?
I feel there's a lot of hypocrisy and delusion. The United States in the 90s placed sanctions on Iraq, where an estimated 500,000 children died when the president was not a Republican neocon, it was President Clinton. So the country that killed 500,000 children is today trying to teach other countries lessons because 300 people died without a proof what happened exactly or who killed them. It's just weird what I'm hearing every day since the crisis started in Syria. For example, in Egypt, a US ally, in one day the Egyptian military killed 650 people, and that was not considered an exceptional case requiring intervention.
What would you consider? What would you consider? Because I'm looking here at an Al Jazeera story which is reporting back on United Nations figures. So here on this story, and this was out in June. So they're looking at 93,000 people killed in Syria in the last 2.5 years. That's an estimate. It's a low estimate. When do you feel that it's okay for the world to step in and maybe stop another death?
Well, the world should have stepped in.
Where's your red line?
Okay, first of all, who killed the 93,000? The regime killed more than half of them, according to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which is an opposition outlet, if you want, London-based. According to them, the latest thing I read 2 months ago was that 43,000 died from the government side, between Syrian army, between armed civilians which are pro-regime, they call them the National Defense Forces, and what
But Camille, it seems quite callous to be breaking down numbers like that. I just see dead bodies, 92,000 dead bodies.
I really
where's the point that you feel that you do want international help?
Okay, first of all, we have an assumption here that international intervention is by the Vatican or by Switzerland type. The reason we have this conflict is because of the United States and Russia, they have a stake. The regional countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have a stake, and Turkey and Qatar. Also, we have the Muslim Brotherhood project. At the beginning, it was supposed to be promoted by Qatar and Turkey. Then we moved into Saudi Arabia, sponsoring the regime toppling effort. Right, so there are so many conflicts taking place, and we cannot just imagine that, the international community is something that we call the international
community. So Camille, you avoided my question, but maybe you can maybe respond to Simon. Simon, I know you want to jump in, and then Kurt will come to you.
I just disagree with that. I think 100,000 people have died in Syria. These are crimes that are going on there. Not just the chemical weapons attack. I think there's something deeply shocking when chemical weapons are used. But we've seen massacres of women and children. We've seen fixed-wing aircraft be used against residential areas, shelling of residential areas, war crimes committed on both sides, although on a much larger scale by the government. This is a deeply shocking situation, and I think one of the really positive things happened in 2005 was when the world said there are some crimes that are so terrible they are a stain upon the conscience of the world and they diminish us all as human beings. So for me, what happens in Syria is not just about Syrians, it's about all of us as human beings, and that's why I think there absolutely has to be an international response. That's not to say I'm for necessarily for bombing Syria or for a full-scale military intervention.
Sure.
But I think for 2 years the world has done absolutely nothing, and it's an absolute disgrace.
That's exactly the point.
No, the world has done a lot, actually.
Camille, hold tight for 1 second. I want to get to Kurt, and then we'll come back to you.
But that's exactly the point, is that this all started with peaceful civil protests in Syria about governance in Syria. You know, simple things like people deciding to all wear white and congregate in one place and then scatter again when the regime found out that they were there. The regime then used violence against these protesters again and again. And there was a resistance to taking up arms in the Syrian opposition because they didn't want to get into the situation of a civil war, but they were driven into it by relentless attacks by the government. And now we've seen, as Simon just said, you know, whole cities leveled. Look at the photos of Aleppo. This whole city is leveled by government artillery and aircraft and bombing. You can't say there's any kind of equivalency on the side of the rebellion and the side of the government. There's an effort of people to try to defend themselves, and that is what drew in the international community. There was no international involvement before that. It was the response to that that brought in Qatar, the UAE, or Turkey, or Egypt in some ways, and that brought in Hezbollah and Iran and Russia supporting the Syrian government. And I would argue the only part of this conflict that is not getting any support is the ones who would look for a more pluralistic and inclusive Syria as opposed to either of the extreme movements.
You know, we are seeing limited support among our community for intervention. James Dollins on Twitter says, if the West does not intervene, then the terrible status quo continues. But Camille, I'd like you to have a listen to this video comment and let me know what you think.
Tweeting yes to war, not to war is not a solution. It's not a ballot that will decide if the US will attack. It's easy to say interventions are wrong when you're not putting your children to sleep, not speaking to them again, and having to put ice cubes on them in order for them not to decompose. Person in their right mind is always against the war, but if a person with authority does not intervene, then the massacre will just escalate. And previous wars might have been driven by greed, but I think this one is actually to save Syria.
So Camille, she says it's easy to say interventions are wrong when you're not putting your children to sleep, not having to speak to them again. Of course, you still have family there. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that we have to start from forgetting that there's an evil side, and this is not a dictator versus people. The problem with the Syrian conflict is that it came after Tunisia and Egypt, where those two scenarios were a dictator versus the people, which was a simplification, of course. But fine, in 3 weeks, it turned out that there's not enough support for the dictators, and they were toppled. In Syria, since day one, I've been saying, what you're calling a dictator, he is a dictator, but he was popular enough. And I have so many articles by David Ignatius and who attest to that. They say he was very popular. So we started with a revolution where part of the population, a good part, genuinely would love to get rid of the dictator. But the problem is that there's another large part, we don't know how many. Syria is 24 million people. Nobody has evidence to how many are on each side and how many are in the center. My guess is it's a bell curve. That's how populations are distributed. The majority of Syrians do not care much about politics. We found that in Egypt, for example, Egyptians were given the opportunity finally to vote on a constitution when President Morsi tried to change the constitution of the country, and it was a very controversial constitution, which was an Islamist constitution.
Because we have very limited time in this program. I appreciate the wide context that you're giving us. Unfortunately, the time is ticking. I want to remind our audience the reason why we started this conversation is looking at these pictures here of this chemical weapons attack outside of Damascus in a suburb. So they're going to look at those pictures, and I'm going to say, when you saw those pictures, what action then do you think should be taken? If not a military intervention, what do you suggest should be done?
I suggest working on Geneva. Why isn't anybody interested in working hard on Geneva? Do you know how much effort did they put on trying to make Geneva work? Nothing. While they're willing to go to war, and we've seen previous assaults on Middle Eastern countries where they led. I mean, Libya, they spent 6 months bombarding Libya, and Gaddafi only had less than 10,000 non-professional soldiers with no regional allies. And it took them 6 months, and they could not overthrow him without putting boots on the ground. The Syrian army is much, much stronger. There's Iran, there's Hezbollah, there's Iraq also, the Shia axis, if you want, on the side of the Syrian regime, and the army is much larger. What kind of action do you want to make a difference? What kind of intervention? What happened to Geneva? Why don't you try Geneva first? Just go to Geneva and let's see, let's talk, let's hear both sides, and the Syrian people will decide. Nobody's interested. They just are loving it. They want to go to war again.
Okay, in my view, this is a big fallacy in the way people understand diplomacy and use of force. That when one side has a preponderance of force, and then you're trying to negotiate with another, it takes a tremendous act of magnanimity and will on the part of that group exercising force to be willing to negotiate with a partner that has none. And this is what we face in Syria, is that the regime in Syria has said, we want to reassert our power and control, period. And what's there to negotiate in a place like Geneva, and where is the counterbalancing force against that? And I agree that we want a negotiated settlement at the end of this that brings people around the table and is inclusive.
Omar, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we should just look at the simple, cold facts of the situation. You know, as Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi, the UN envoy and the Arab League, formerly Arab League envoy to the Syrian crisis, said yesterday, this is not a trigger-happy White House. And to suggest that they're just waiting to jump in is a fundamental misreading and a fundamentally dishonest reading of the facts. You know, we had an Arab League monitoring mission come to Syria under General Dabi. This was in late 2011, early 2012. We had the Arab League monitors leave when they were not successful. Then we had the UN monitors go into Syria. We had massacres occurring in front of their very eyes, like the Hula massacre. After the UN monitoring mission came in, we had the Kofi Annan plan. The Kofi Annan plan failed. The monitors left Syria. Then we had summer of 2012 in Mexico in the G20, Obama meeting Putin, talking about the Geneva Accords. We have this whole agreement at Geneva to try to do something, completely fails. This next month, the President's National Security Council, Petraeus, Secretary Clinton, all calling on him to arm the rebels, him rejecting this. You know, we've gone through a very long time. Now with Geneva 2 and the meetings with Lavrov and Kerry in May of 2013. Now, if the United States was just waiting to jump in and intervene, I mean, they would have intervened a long time ago. After 100,000 Syrians killed, 12 alleged chemical weapons attacks, and then now this latest attack, you know, I just think it'd be fundamentally dishonest reading of the situation to read it in this way.
Well, Simon, the question that some of our community members are posing is, who pays the ultimate price? On Facebook, E. Tate Carter says, who loses if nothing happens? Who benefits if nothing happens? I think that's a fair question. And we have a video commenter who thinks he knows. Have a listen to this.
There are two main concerns with regards to a potential airstrike in Syria. The first concern is that a limited airstrike will only further empower Bashar al-Assad simply based off of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The second concern is that President Obama's public timeline of makes you stronger. The second concern is that President Obama's public timeline of hypothetical events has given Assad time to move human shields into sensitive potential target locations of a U.S. or coalition airstrike.
So, Simon, your quick answer before we move over to the post show.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a legitimate comment. I mean, I think the real question is if there are going to be military airstrikes in Syria, are they going to be about punishment, or are they going to be about deterrent, or are they going to be about what they should be about, which is about the protection of civilians? And that's the most fundamental point, and I think it's the point that was made by the ambassador earlier. And ultimately, I think, you know, this can't be just about pursuing punishment. It has to be about pursuing a political solution.
Excellent. Okay, so that wraps it up for our main show right now. There's so much more to talk about on this issue. Don't forget that if you want to actually be part of our conversation, you can actually vote on our poll. It is a poll about military intervention in Syria. What could possibly happen? Better? Will it make the situation better or worse? No difference. You can vote, and then that vote gets tweeted out. So we will be following that vote to see how things change during our program and on the post show, which is where we're heading in just a moment. Let me tell you about Monday. Monday is going to be very, very interesting. The Prime Minister of Iceland will be in the stream. You can join the conversation by tweeting questions to him at AJStream. Ask him anything, and we will find out on Monday if he'll answer anything. Stay with us. The post show is next at stream.aljazeera.com. We'll see you online. Thanks for watching. Hello again, welcome to the Streams Post Show, where we're talking about Syria today and potential military intervention after a chemical weapons attack that was seen on August the 21st in a suburb just outside of Damascus, Syria. Kurt Volker is with us. He's a former US ambassador to NATO. He's been making the case for military intervention in Syria for more than a year. Simon Adams, Executive Director of the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect. Omar Hosseino is a Syrian foreign and defense policy researcher and a contributor to the website Syria Deeply. He's in favor of limited intervention. And Camille Otrachi is a Syrian commentator who is against any use of military force. So let's get back to the conversation. There is something that people in the diplomatic world, the UN world, know. It's a phrase called the right to protect. I want to play a little comment from British Prime Minister David Cameron. I'm going to ask Simon to explain it very simply for our audience so that you all understand what it means as well, because that's kind of critical in this conversation. So here is British Prime Minister David Cameron speaking to Parliament earlier on Thursday, putting the case for military intervention in Syria right now.
Not be the case that that is the only way to have a legal basis for action, and we should consider for a moment what the consequences would be if that were the case. You could have a situation in a country where its government was literally annihilating half the people in that country, but because of one veto on the Security Council you would be hampered from taking any action. Now, I can't think of any member in any party of this House who'd want to sign up to that, and that's why it's important we do have the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, which is set out in the Attorney General's excellent legal advice to this House. Let me give way to my honourable...
So that's David Cameron talking about the right to protect. Simon, very easily, can you explain what that means and why it's critical to this conversation?
Sure. First of all, it's the responsibility to protect, not the right.
Sorry, responsibility to protect. Thank you for the correction.
We don't talk about rights. We talk about states having responsibilities, and I think the first one of those responsibilities is the state has a responsibility under the that was adopted in 2005 at the UN World Summit to protect its own populations from mass atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. And then secondly, the international community has a responsibility to assist the state to uphold those responsibilities, but if they're manifestly failing or unwilling to uphold those responsibilities, then it says that the international community has a responsibility to protect. And that's where we're seeing now this massive debate around what should be done in Syria. But I should point out that the responsibility to protect does say that it needs to be via the UN Security Council and needs to be legitimate under international law.
See, here's the problem though, Simon, with this. It sounds amazing, fantastic, great, all the world got together, decided about this doctrine. It makes sense when you see atrocities happen around the world. But this has been happening in Syria for 2.5 years. So there's something that's not quite working here. There's a disconnect.
Well, here's the shocking news, of course, is that the world is not a perfect place, as we know. And I think, the responsibility to protect, R2P as it's called and its acronym, has actually made a real difference in countries like Kenya, in South Sudan, in Cote d'Ivoire. And of course, there was a very controversial military intervention in Libya, which was invoked under R2P, in Yemen and in a range of countries. But it's primarily a preventive doctrine, not a military doctrine. But what we've got in Syria is a case where, a very, very difficult case, where a member of the Security Council is a strong ally of the regime and seems determined to actually defend it from any kind of sense of international accountability or international responsibility. So I think it's not so much a question of the failure of the responsibility to protect in the specific case of Syria, as it is a failure of the United Nations Security Council and a failure of early response. I agree with the ambassador that the time that the international community needed to be engaging with this problem, not necessarily militarily, but needed to be engaging with this problem, was 2.5 years ago. And at every single stage they've been blocked by Russian and Chinese vetoes. And that's the real tragedy that history is going to judge very, very harshly.
Well, Kurt, in thinking about the responsibility to protect, we also have to take into account what our community is saying is a very legitimate distrust of the powers that be. So Mel on Twitter says many don't trust the US, the UK, and the rest because of the mess they've left in Iraq. So there is a precedence for international military intervention. That's not necessarily a good one.
Well, and I would agree. One should never think that military is the solution to everything, and one should never think it's a first resort. But at the same time, what I would say to people who are making those arguments is that everything that everyone is worried about in the terms of international use of force in stopping a conflict like this is happening without that use of force. So all of the deaths, all of the assassinations, the torture, the destruction of cities, the refugees, a couple million at this point, and now use of chemical weapons, all of this destruction is happening without intervention. And so I think that if people are concerned about the consequent intervention, we should also be concerned about the consequences of not doing it.
So being a social media show, we were very curious to see what was trending on Twitter regarding Syria and potential military intervention. So we looked at the most popular hashtags and they were all against intervention. Have a look at this. We did find one hashtag that was actually for the intervention, and that was a French one, and that had 161 mentions. But it looks like Twitter is with you, Camille. They don't want any military intervention in Syria. What do you make of that?
I make of that activists in general, they're anti-war always. We've had, I mean, I'm happy they're with me, but I'll be honest that they're always against war. just like they're always with the people demonstrating. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, they were all with the Syrian people against the regime. So people do not have the time to really study the Syria crisis and understand every small detail of it to make an informed decision. I mean, again, I'm happy they're against war. They learned lessons, but that's not what I'm counting for. I would like the opportunity to hear from the Syrian people. I wish the United States and France and the international community from day one demanded from the Syrian regime an opinion poll. We would like to see where the Syrian people are. Nobody asked what the Syrian people want. They just assumed, oh, they're just like Tunisia and Egypt. They want to overthrow the regime. And we realize now, no, the Syrian people are split. There are strong opposition supporters and strong regime supporters, and in the middle, many more, in my opinion.
Camille, what is your gut telling you is going to happen next?
I've been hearing from friends in Washington, D.C. That this will be more than a slap on the wrist, but less than something that will force Iran to intervene, for example, or Hezbollah. They don't want the crisis to widen beyond Syria's borders, but they want it to be taken seriously if they hit. So it's what you've been reporting, dozens of targets, military, hopefully, targets. They will do it, I think, because after John Kerry's passionate speech on this issue, I don't see how they cannot hit. I think they will.
Yeah, Omar, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to jump in. We're mentioning polls. I think a great poll to mention is Gallup's poll. 6 months after the intervention in Libya, guess which country in the Middle East has the highest approval rating of the United States after Israel? That's Libya. 54% of Libyans approve of the United States. This is actually even higher than Canada, where Camille lives. And Shibli Telhami's poll after the Libyan intervention found that every single other Arab country other than Libya had a majority of people against the intervention. So, it's easy to be against conflicts or tough choices or interventions when you don't live in the country yourself. And I think I agree with Camille. It's very important to bear in mind what the Syrian people actually think. Despite other anti-war activists throughout the world.
We're almost at the end of the program. I'm going to check in with the poll. I'm going to check in with Malika. I have so many things to do and so little time. Kurt, you've been talking about this for over a year, so I'm not sure I should listen to what you have to say next, because no one else is, but I trust your political expertise here. What do you think is going to happen next? Not what do you want, but what will, do you think?
No, I'm not sure. I tend to agree with Khalil that it's fairly likely that the U.S. administration, joined by others, will engage in a limited military action to create a deterrent to the future use of chemical weapons. That's, I think, likely, but I'm not 100% sure because there's been a backlash in the UK, in the US, in Germany, about the idea of just launching into this and getting entangled in the Syrian conflict and not knowing what the next steps are. And also a little bit of uncertainty still under the surface about how sure are we it was the regime, or what would we do if next time it's not the regime, or what would we do if they do it again. I think a lot of those doubts are still there, so I'm not 100% sure, but I do think Khalil's probably right.
That's a very classy nuance. I have no idea what's going to happen next. I do have an idea, though, about our poll. Do you remember? Have a look on my laptop where we started off. The question was, would international military strikes against Syria make the situation there better? 17% said better. 52% said worse. 31% no difference. That was at the beginning of the show. 40 minutes later, what are they saying, control room? There you go. That's the results. A little bit of change there in terms of people's attitudes as they were listening to our expert guests. Talking about our online community and their attitudes, where are they leaving us?
Well, it's interesting that it went up over the course of our 25-minute show. People think it will be worse. And the tweets reflect that. There's a tweet here from Ratty who says, "No one's made the U.S. and its allies world police. I detest Assad, but I don't support foreign intervention."
You know, all of our guests have so much more to say, and it's very frustrating for me to have to say goodbye to them, but thank you so much for being part of this conversation. You really helped us understand different perspectives as the rest of the world debate whether to take a military intervention and military strikes in Syria. Now, where will I take you on Monday? Well, I am going to bring you the Prime Minister of Iceland. Yes, he will be in the stream. Join the conversation by tweeting questions to him at AJ Stream. You can ask him absolutely anything, and we will find out on Monday if he will answer absolutely anything. In the meantime, we will be online at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Take care.